All right, we're live again. Thank you both for being here on this wonderful Friday. And we're actually outside of Black History Month, right? But I think it's such a beautiful thing to continue the conversations into the future and really talk about ways that we can both conserve and preserve Blackness today and the beyond. So I thought it might be great for you to introduce yourself and kind of let us know like who you are, what you do, and maybe we'll start there.
Yeah, thank you for that and for this very kind invitation. I have a relationship with UW Law School. So in before times, was spending time in Seattle thinking about some of the themes that I'm going to discuss. So my name's Mutale Nkonde. I founded and I lead a communications firm called AI for the People. And what we really seek to do is use film, television, and journalism to add a technical analysis to racial justice discourse. Because one of the things that we found was in 2020, many of the conversations around race that were being had were very much in the analog. So, for example, if we think about policing, there wasn't an acknowledgement that policing is a technical project, whether we are thinking about facial recognition as a tool of policing, or if we think about the wealth gap, we're also not thinking about the way algorithmic actors decide mortgage determinations, for example, and the impact that that would have on Black people. Or if we're thinking about health, how pain management systems and specifically the Black maternal health crisis is because algorithmic systems are not necessarily giving Black women the pain meds that they need at the times that they need them, and then they're going into distress. And so we came in to fill in that gap because we felt that the full story of how we're living, not in the future, but actually in the present as technical citizens, as well as being analog citizens, wasn't being told. And we've been pretty successful. It's based on work I've been doing over the last decade in this area, but AI for the People as a legal entity, as a commercial entity, as a nonprofit entity, has only existed since 2019. And where we received an Emmy last year for a piece that we had done on facial recognition and shareholder activism. And it was a group of these really dope nuns that have been buying Microsoft stock and other tech stock since really the 90s. They're a really big shareholder group that use that to make what they consider to be moral decisions. And then this year, we've just completed a short called Blackness Unbound, Afrofuturism and the Revolutionary Imagination, that was entered to the Smithsonian Museum of Air and Space in January and is going through the festival circuit. So we've already been admitted to Martha's Vineyard's um, African American Film Festival in the HBO Shorts category, and we completed an Oscar qualifying run. Where are we? March last month. So we're just going to see how far that can get us. But within that film, we're really looking at social media and how social media impacts Black folks from a disinformation and misinformation standpoint, and it's experimental. So you see like trains going forward and backwards with time, and it's great. And then this past week, I testified in front of the House Commerce and Energy Committee because we want our stories to be seen by Black people, but also Black policymakers. So there is a bill that I've been working on for the last 5 years that looks at algorithmic accountability that I got to testify for in front of the House this week. And we do stuff in the EU. We do a lot. We do a lot. We're trying to tell this story.
Wow, wow, wow. That is so amazing to hear. First, just like a general overview of what you're working on, but like I had never realized how deep you guys got into both policy side as well as the arts. You know, I from the outside, I didn't recognize that. So it's really cool to see how you're merging these two worlds, particularly when we're having a conversation about Afrofuturism, which feels like it mobilizes both in the aesthetic and art world as well as in this realm of praxis, right? Um, so kind of you know using that as a launching point, I think something that you said that was pretty interesting was this idea of when we think about the Black Liberation Project, oftentimes we think about it in like a very analog sense, and when we think about like the work that you are doing right now, it is trying to accomplish change in the present, right? It's like these are systems that already exist and they are already impacting us in both negative and positive ways, right? So I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about how you see your work relating to this concept of Afrofuturism.
So we actually think that Afrofuturism collapses time. So we are working today because we believe that there will be Black people in the future and we are preparing for them to be free. And I think that's a very Afrofuturistic stand on the world, that we can use linear time at the point that we meet it to both relitigate the past. So we see this a lot with Maddie's Rocket and those comic books that go to a past where we were free, but also really shape time. Because prior to me starting this work, I'd worked within the tech industry. And one of the things that I really loved about working in places like Google is that they will say things like the best way to survive in the future is to create it. These are not Afrofuturists. So they're thinking about a future in which white supremacy persists, in which toxic masculinity persists, and they innovate towards that future. And I really think that what our work is doing is shaping a future in which Blackness is unbound. And that's why we gave our film that title, because it's the things that it's the code that is written now that feed the machines of the future that then impact the way that we're living. And going back to my relationship with Seattle as a city, one of the exciting things that's going on in the law school, for example, is a lot of those students. I have a really deep relationship with Professor William Covington over there, who's an African-American legal scholar, and he pushes his students to think about writing law that is taken to Washington State that looks at some of these issues. My issue around that is that we are not in those classrooms. And so as even the most well-meaning non-Black people are going to get exhausted by a fight for liberation that is not theirs. So, and they are attempting to do this Afrofuturistic work without the connection to the source, without the connection to the problem. And so we're very excited about being part of an Afrofuturistic movement that really, I think, activates the power of story, because policymakers are one audience, but so are Black mothers in the church, so are school children, so are government workers, these are all our audiences, because we know that the quest for Black freedom, autonomy, and dignity is something that we have successfully handed from generation to generation to generation in time immemorial. And we are just doing our tiny little part by throwing a light on algorithmic systems, and not just the ones that we use now, but we're as interested in social media as we are in the metaverse, as we are in Web3, as we are in these other more emergent and untested technological planes.
I love how you are talking about the importance of flattening the hierarchy I feel like a lot of times, and Kadala, you spoke to this earlier, right? When people think about Afrofuturism, they might think, oh, it's aesthetic, it's entertainment, it's this, or it's just the technical and not the analog. It's not the technologies that we can't, interface with, right? And this whole notion of, okay, we're all participants and we all have different stakes and making and creating this present and therefore creating the future that we want to see together. And so I would love to hear, who were your first Afrofuturist inspirations? And I know you had mentioned, it could also be the mother or the auntie or like the child, but I would love to hear like what kind of sparked your interest in this field and reference of thought. Yeah.
I think for me, and this probably tells you my age too, but for me, it was music coming out in the mid 90s and remixes. Because what was happening with remixes is that they were taking Black music from the past that I had listened to as a child with my parents that had specific timestamps. Because as I'm Zambian and grew up in the UK, but as an immigrant child in this hugely white space, to have those records was home, because it was with the few people that I felt safe with. And to hear those memories of the past be put on top of a beat and made present in that way ultimately created memories that I hold to in the future, memories that I would hold to in the future, moments that would shape how I think about vitality and I think about joy and I think about, even now as a mother, the kinds of conditions I want to recreate so that I know my children can take those on. And it was really clear to me that Black people were doing some really cool things with technology, and they were having this really positive impact on my spirit. And so I wanted to know what that was. And it was really music that made me much more interested in, well, what other Black people are thinking about the future. And it was after that that I started to become interested in Janelle Monáe, because the ARC Android album was coming out. And through Janelle, I found Sun Ra, because her references are Sun Ra. And through Sun Ra, I then found Octavia Butler, because once you start going down that rabbit hole, you start to discover new people. And then N.K. Jemisin got the Hugo Prize. And so I was like, oh, there is this larger literature. And it became really clear to me that you didn't actually need to have a space rocket or care for science fiction or not. Or the ways that I think Afrofuturism is very exclusive in many ways had been completely flattened for me because of the remix.
Yeah. This idea of the remix is something that we've encountered a few times in these conversations, and I feel like it really speaks to what you mentioned even in your first response around how Afrofuturism flattens time, and kind of it's us interacting at this particular slice, right? But it is really about both that looking back as well as looking back while moving forward, right? This
Right.
Sankofa idea, right? And I think something that I'm really interested in, though, based off of what you just said, is you mentioned sometimes it feels like Afrofuturism might not be the most inclusive term, right? Or sometimes there are problems that we have within this terminology. So I was wondering if there are other terms that you feel more suitable, or if there are like specific aspects of the term Afrofuturism that you would like to unpack in your work, or that you are unpacking in your work. Yeah.
No, I am very much aware of this idea of African futurism versus Afrofuturism, because Mark Daly coined that term in, this essay, Black to the Future, which is kind of problematic because he's suggesting, well, how could people be so oppressed, care about the future, without realizing that we can be oppressed in bodily state and free in mind, and we have always been. And so we're not that interested in how white people are perceiving us. That's kind of their business and their work, because we have this ability to create, recreate, and remix ourselves. And so I see that. However, what I don't like about the African futurism critique is African futurists would say that afrofuturism is very much grounded and based on the American experience. And I would actually fight that and say that there have been revolutionary movements amongst Black bodies and Black lives throughout time, throughout space, throughout geography. And certainly coming from an ANC family, really see how Black Lives Matter as an American construct was conceived of in the freeing of Nelson Mandela, right? That was a fight that we're willing and strong to have. I can see how freedom movements in the Caribbean also have those hallmarks. And so when you're talking about this is based on the American experience, we are sitting in a moment where Nigerian students are being thrown off trains at coming out of the Ukraine because they do not look like they should be in the Ukraine. And let's think about that. So I don't know that oppression can be anti-Blackness can just be packaged to an American aesthetic, a Russian aesthetic. I feel like it's constant. It just shows up differently. And for that reason, the term Afrofuturism works for me. However, having said that, if you want Zambian futurism, which is where I'm from, and I randomly found out that my dad had been part of the Zambian space mission, which was the first space mission my family are so random. The first space mission ever to exist, and it was between 1960 and 1969. And he was like, oh, I'm so proud of you for getting into the Smithsonian. And I was saying, yeah, there was this woman talking about the Zambian space mission. And he was like, oh yeah, I did it after school. And then just kind of went on to talk about, like, do something else. So I see, having been Black in a lot of different contexts, it actually really shows up in the same way in any geography. And so I'm happy with that. If you want to be an African futurist, do you, boo. But don't come for other people. Like, we're not your enemies. Go somewhere else with that mess.
It's really go to space, Mars, wherever you want to go with that, but we're not doing it here. There's enough to deal with. No, I love this concept of, we should be self-determined and we should be able to, name how we want to be described, right? And I think part of the tension that even Kadala and I have expressed in being Black and being Black around different spaces and places, so just the disciplines we work in, and then also living in different countries and coming into contact with different Blacknesses, right? And trying to understand, okay, well, what is our emancipatory project as a diaspora, and what are the things we need? And so I would love to ask you, since we're more interested in kind of flattening Afrofuturism than kind of delineating, it to a certain locality, not saying you're against that, but what are the Afrofuturist values you feel kind of go across the board, across boundaries or false borders?
I think infinite hope and infinite possibility. I really, I look at, sorry, I'm in Brooklyn, New York, so clearly it has to be noisy. It has no other way of being apart from being really loud and obnoxious. So I'm sorry about that. I would say that one of the things about science fiction that always gets me is how it's always a dystopia. And it's always white. So I recently watched the beginning of the first Superman movie, And I was like, why is the whole planet white? And why are they wearing white outfits? And then why is everybody else there white? And then the one bad person is Black. This lets me know that as that world was being built and as that world was being created, this notion of whiteness was a dominant motif. Whereas I think the values of Afrofuturism is that, to the point I just made about noise, it's always noisy, it's always colorful, it's always hopeful, even when we are in dystopia. And I think that Octavia Butler does that the best in the Parable series, where you're reading the book and you're like, wait, they've got to live behind a wall. Wait, the 3-year-old died, but wait. But then you have Earthseed. And I think that that balance is something that we also saw in the freedom movement for Nelson Mandela, where you had this freedom fighter for 27 years behind, captured, and people sang every day, people went to work every day, people lived their lives every day, and they still did this work. We can also see right now in this moment with the crisis in Ukraine that yes, those Nigerian students were pushed off trains, but then they went to the international press and said that this is wrong, we're not putting up for it. And so in that advocacy and in that agency, I see hope in the midst of sorrow. And that's probably the best part of my Blackness, because I'm constantly under attack. People are constantly trying to steal. People are constantly trying to kind of columbize my work. And I allow that to happen because not only am I protected by the ancestors, but you can never take what's not yours. And you're not in my brain. And so you don't know what move I'm about to stick at any point. And I've probably already left you in the dust because I don't believe in time. So you've only got me at that, like, haha, you've got me at this moment in time, and I'm light years ahead or behind you.
Wow. That last point is particularly poignant in terms of a conversation that Mia and I were just having about something similar around when we're doing this sort of work, wanting to find that balance between, we believe that knowledge should be free, that information should be out there for everybody to act upon. But that feeling, it can feel not great when you recognize that somebody has, taken your words, repackaged them a little bit, and then presented them as their own. So just personally, I feel like you have given me a new way of looking at this that I'm going to definitely carry forward as I move forward. Yeah.
Because they're not dope.
And
when you're corny, you do corny things.
Yeah. I think, so are there any other organizations that are working right now that you look to find a lot of inspiration, or that you have enjoyed collaborating with in the way that you are moving forward in this mission?
Yeah, Data for Black Lives is doing great work on making sure that, I don't know if you've heard of this software, ID.me. It's a facial recognition company that is going to all of these local governments. And they actually just threw them out of Washington State yesterday. I was reading the Seattle Times because ID.me, I think, wanted to be integrated into unemployment claims. But the problem is facial recognition doesn't recognize dark faces 40% of the time. And so if you had to have your face match to get your money, that is going to impact Black people in a way that's devastating. They've actually found that out in Florida. And a lot of that advocacy is done by Data for Black Lives. They got the IRS to drop ID.me because ID.me were going to make us use our faces to access taxes. And I'm like, look, that's clearly Black and brown and poor faces, because rich people don't even really pay taxes like they should over here. So you're not going to see them. And I love that they do the advocacy work, because we do the translation and the communication work. We think of ourselves as the griot. We're not going to go and get 1,000 Black people together to go down to the offices. We're not going to call you out in name. but we will create a culture that makes what you're doing intolerable. And so I really like them. I really like the work that I'm seeing, that we will see with Timnit Gebru's research institute. She was at Google and got fired for writing these papers that were critical of the way the Google algorithm works because of its environmental impact. And it was really, really public. And she's recently got funding to set up another research group. I think that she'll be dope as hell. Those are the two that I definitely keep up. There are many, many, many more, but AI for the People is deeply engaged and a lot of their own work. So we're very inward facing. We are doing some work that will feed into a larger project that Color of Change are heading. And we've kind of been, we are in each other's orbit. And so there's certain elements of their work I really like as well.
I have to say shouts to Washington State for kicking the girls out, because that's not the future that we need. And I love that you were able to kind of speak to different organizations that are activating for Black people in different ways, right? You're like, we're not going to be the ones collecting the girls to do the march, but we are going to be creating policy and creating storytelling that invites people to learn more. And so, like, for me, I feel like in doing this project with Kadala and also just meeting everyone, including you, and talking about this work, it's been so inspirational, but also has kind of like opened me up to the different potentialities when it comes to Afrofuturism and technology. And I oftentimes think, well, how am I going to tell like my young cousins or my father about this? And it dilutes to technology and the technology gap, and figuring out ways to also kind of build that bridge within our community. And so I would love to hear like what your organization is doing, or what you particularly think is helpful when we're talking about closing the tech gap within Black communities.
I actually think that it's an information gap. So we're running 2 projects and kind of preparing another one, which we can't really speak about yet too much because it's still under development. But we're with journalists, we are really trying to raise how social media algorithms impact our access to information, but specifically the truth. And what that looks like are a podcast that we're going to be releasing in June, because our anniversary is Juneteenth. So that's going to be like one of the new things that we do. We're also, I sit on the board of directors for the National Association of Black Journalists. And so impacting some of their learning webinars, so Black journalists can come in, as well as kind of like workshops that we'll be doing with them. But what we do within those workshops is that we make the material super understandable to that audience. So rather than speaking about Russian interference for an hour, even though we do reference it from a misinformation perspective, we also talk about the Tasha K case and how what she did was use misinformation to allege that Cardi B had this history of STIs. And because of the way algorithmic decision making is set up, those happened to be the shows in which most people watched. They drove her up the YouTube algorithm and they created this wealth. And so that helps people kind of unpack not just the social media business model, but how information and its how bad news travels. And then really ask Black people to reflect. Do we hate sex workers? Is it a problem? Is having an STI a problem that is a general problem for all Black people? Or is it actually a private health matter? And by the way, she never had one. And then the $4 million fine, I think, makes something like misinformation that can feel very nebulous and what does it mean? And I don't care about Russia and I'm tuning out Trump into something that we're seeing right now. So our strategy is always popular culture and comedy as our tools of translation. So that's happening. And we call that pillar of work Black Lives Online. And then we have another pillar of work, which is really similar to this, actually, called Black in 2042. And what we're looking at are the stories we have to tell, the policies we have to enact, the advocacy that we have to do to thrive in the near future. And the reason that we chose 2042 was Black people in America in 2002 woke up on January 1st and the Patriot Act had been enacted. And that completely changed the way that for the first time in history, the US government could track and surveil a person as opposed to their device. So this is in kind of clause 206 that looks at wiretapping. And what ended up happening is 13 years later, we get the NSA leaks where we find out that not only were the NSA trying to find like bad people, because this came about after 9/11. So those bad people were brown, they were Black, but we're gathering phone and electronic records on all Americans. And that's what underpins the social media business model that we have today. And so in that, we're trying to figure out what are the priorities of Black people, what should we be looking at? Are we thinking about this as a technical project? Are we thinking about this in the analog? And what can we do together over the next 20 years to get to that place? And we're speaking to everybody from Same Foot from the New Georgia Project and how they use technology in civic engagement, and they flip Georgia through to Uche Blackstone, who is an MSNBC contributor around health and how public health, what's the future for public health and how can we think about that, through to Diamond Styles, who's the executive director of Trans Black Women's Inc., that really thinks about how biometric technologies are looking at people that sit in between gender binaries and how we need to really, our technologies need to know that men and women are not the only genders that are around. So how do we control for that? And then we will be putting out a report at the end of the year that really challenges this idea that Wakanda is a fictional place, that there are actually Wakandian actors right now who are projecting these new futures. And it's exciting. It's really, it's exciting for my team, I think, to do that work. I love the transcripts, and we're just looking to figure out what themes come out of it so that we know how to work.
Yeah. Wow. Oh man, there's just I'm speechless with the different, all of the different like disciplines, or like, I guess, yeah, all of the different disciplines within this realm of technology, that each one of these emerging technologies, it feels like there is another front, that we need to be aware of how we engage with it. And at times it can feel very overwhelming, right? Like when
It can, but I think there are really easy ways to break it down. So, for example, I don't know if you all have heard, but the metaverse is in beta, and one of the chief research officers went into the metaverse in December and was sexually assaulted by male avatars. And it's because there are no controls in the metaverse. Because if you think about the people who are building out this virtual environment, they're probably not people who are femmes. They clearly hate women because the avatars were saying, sorry, I'm getting I'm plugging myself in. They were saying, you know, you love it, you love it. Don't try to resist us. So these are people who definitely are in rape culture. And when we were talking about it internally, I was like, look, the metaverse ultimately is a headset. And what they're going to do is market the headset in the same way that we market PS5 or we market Jordans or we market. And the way that you counter message is that you show how ridiculous it is to get raped in the metaverse if you could take that shit off. And I truly believe that Black women, under those circumstances, would snatch that headset off and beat the avatars in real life who are doing that. Like, that just seemed like a very interesting problem. But if we're not going in and if we're not letting people know that this is going to come to you by a headset, you have the right to use that headset or to not use that headset. And for all of you people buying houses in the metaverse, where are you going to live in the analog? Do not get bamboozled by this. That we have the right to refusal, but the dominant story around technology is that I want to be the first, I want to adopt, and so what happens if you have shows like Abbott's Elementary, for example, that had a whole episode about ed tech, come to find out that ed tech was actually a carceral tech that was trying to predict which little Black kids could read so that they could build prison sites. And that was in the context of comedy. I feel like presenting it in a script in that way, or presenting it in a TV film, in a TV show, or in a film, is the way that we want to translate that, because otherwise it becomes way too overwhelming, way too jargony. Somebody is going to think it's really cute to buy you this thing and not tell you that it's completely unregulated. Oh, and by the way, the people that made it are the same people that did Facebook. And remember all of those people that got killed in Myanmar? Knock yourself out with the headset.
I feel like my spirit has been choked so many times during this conversation. But I feel like it's important to really break down, you know, the urgency of the issue. Because I think for a lot of people, again, they're at different stage of adaptation, right? Like some people want to be early adapters and they're ready to hop into the metaverse. You have folks that are a little bit more, you know, unsure about how they even relate to AR, VR. They prefer the analog. And then you have people like all of us here, right, where we're working about like Black futurist, you know, emancipatory, like not just the project, but the activation of it in the now and in the future, and thinking, okay, well, there's these spaces, but how are we protecting ourselves here? Because if you don't have the home, if the earth is not still rotating, then none of that stuff is going to matter in the future. And so yeah, it gives quite a sense of like a snap out of the illusion part of it. But I also feel like, okay, what are the ways that people who might not be in, you know, these conversations that we're having, or might not be in the fields that we're in, how might they protect themselves from this future that's upon us?
I think they just need to be critical. Get into the practice of due diligence and align your values. And if you move on your values, it's going to be really clear what you do, when you do, how you do it. And I think that so much of the issues that anybody faces is when they step outside of their values. So, for example, I mentioned like the erasure and the attack on work, but I don't care about ideas. I actually care about execution. And so if we're all having the same idea, all that means is that we're on the same vibration. That should be a really, really beautiful thing. But you're not going to be able to execute it in the way that I am, and I'm not going to be able to execute it in the way that you are. So if you're stuck at, and so my value is, one of my values is one of abundance. There is enough for everybody anywhere at all times. I'm not going to fight you over that. I'm just going to go and do whatever path I'm on. And so one of my values is critical evaluation of any situation. And is this made for me? Is this going to benefit from me and profit from me in a way that I won't see that benefit? And is this fun? Or do I have to call a million Black people to make it fun? And if I'm trying to recruit fun people, then why am I recruiting for this thing that is ultimately a commercial enterprise when I can just find them where they're at? And I don't think that we did that with social media. I think we all got accounts and then started to do that. But we now know where that's got us. And so we can stop. And I think what's really interesting is having, I have 2 teenagers and they won't go on Facebook because they think it's corny. They're just like, why would I? It's for mothers taking pictures. Like, I'm not going on there. And that's really interesting versus I do advisory work with TikTok versus TikTok as a platform where they will go on it, but then they'll only go on it in certain circumstances to do particular things, but they won't stay on it, which I think is interesting. And then my oldest daughter just got accepted to this New York Times summer program. And so the people wrote to her and they're like, do you want us to give you your Instagram? And then you can become part of the New York Times Instagram. And I was like, do you want to do this? And she was like, no, I don't know them. Why would you want a bunch of white people I don't know all over my social media? And I was like, yeah. And when you get work friends, keep those people off social. They don't need to know anything that you did. You meet them at the job, you leave them at the job, unless they're your actual friend. And so, whereas I remember when I first got social media, I just said yes to everybody and then have spent most of my time. I mean, I'm really not on social media anymore because I now recognize that it's a data aggregator. And I don't like that. I don't understand why people do dating sites. Like, you're all being played. Stop it. Just meet people in the park.
Yeah. I think that something you said that's very powerful is this idea that we need to get better at due diligence, right? And kind of thinking about how when we are designing technologies, oftentimes it's easy for us to for us as users, right? When designers are creating these technologies, you're able to create these dark patterns or patterns that are somewhat nefarious just through like defaults, right? And like what sort of impact does it have when you have this ultra long terms and conditions document whenever you download a new app, that your mind just immediately goes to, oh, I'm just going to scroll through all of this in order to get to accept without actually going through and reading that. And similarly, thinking about when we think about how social media has this effect on all of our lives when we are using these platforms, it's really easy to like. This kind of connects back to an earlier answer that you had around like when we think about surveillance, right? And you talked about the Patriot Act. My mind kind of goes to this idea of like with COINTELPRO, right? We had a very specific instance of Black people being monitored, right? And we can point to that and say, hey, like, look at this thing that has been done. But now living in a world where we're all being monitored in this way, it's a lot harder to have that succinct like example and say, this is the thing that this is the problem, because it's like inside of all of our pockets or inside of all of our homes now. And I really like the way that you frame this in terms of it's a problem of how do we reframe it so that we are taking on that responsibility of self-determination and taking on that responsibility of doing that due diligence, rather than having it be like, oh, we are being monitored or we are being attacked in a particular way, when we also have the ability to take on a certain responsibility ourselves as well.
We do, but we also need laws. Like, I feel like that's a very heavy burden for the individual. And we need to make sure that we have legal safeguards to make sure that these things actually are in the public interest. And I think with social media, what we saw really clearly in 2016 was the targeting of Black Facebook groups as a way to advantage Trump by decreasing Black voter turnout. So I think that we have a really, really, really good case study of how algorithmic systems were used to exploit racial division to really make America a friend of Putin. And now here we are, 7 years later, suffering around that. And if people aren't thinking about that recent example, then I feel really sorry for them. Like, why do you feel comfortable filling out any of those quizzes? Because part of the way that we were got was through those cat quizzes. Why are you on Clubhouse and Twitter Spaces with all your audio data being fed into an algorithm and you don't even know how that information is being used? Why are you using Siri, which is doing the same thing? Why? And I think that this is why it's really important for us to work with legislators to say we should be protected. That way, the due diligence is happening at the governmental level, because we couldn't even get vaccines for COVID until they had been tested for efficacy because of the potential impact on human life. We should also not be subject to algorithmic actors that are going to harm us, because one of the things that people don't realize is that algorithmic actors change the course of time. And the way that they do that is if you are falsely identified, as Robert Williams was in Detroit, as committing a crime because of facial recognition, you are arrested, you are processed, and then the burden is for you to then go and hire an attorney to expunge your record. If you do not have that money, you will forever walk through life with an arrest record. You are not going to be able to undo that. In the same way that if you're looking for, here in New York, they want to use fingerprinting and face scans for housing benefit. What happens if they then share that with other agencies? But beyond that, gentrification isn't an issue of the individual. It is an issue of civic policy. And you are then putting the individual through this regime because there's nothing there to protect them. So while I do think that people need to be more critical, I don't just mean with technology, I mean with their lives. I was watching, I think I watched The Real Housewives of Salt Lake City the other day, and I was so confused and then felt very violated, and then was like, at every point I could have turned off the television because I really did not understand what was going on. I did not know who these people were, but I just got the impression they were very mad at each other and they were screaming and they were fighting, and it messed up my chakras. I was like, I don't know what's happening here. This is very, I could have turned it off, right? In our own work at AI for the People, we were looking at how certain policies also turn time. So we found out that that reality television was given this time to breathe during a writer's strike in 2007. And what the writers were striking for was the right to get online, when their shows were going online, to get paid from that. And they were granted that in 2008. But what happened over the 10 months that they were not writing new shows was that this new type of entertainment rose, which was there were two things: reality TV and TED Talks. The crews all went to work there, and the things that motivated reality TV were appealing to our worst selves. The reason it was so easy for me to find The Real Housewives of Salt Lake City is that we now have whole television networks where people are racist, they're sexist, they're violent, they're showing their worst selves because the audience has been acclimatized to that. And so I put that out as an example of how powerful policy can be to write time and to write kind of our futures as well. It's an imperfect tool, but it's an effective tool.
I must say that I had no clue that the Real Housewives of Salt Lake City was even a thing. I tapped out at Atlanta. Shout outs to Nene Leakes. That was when I put my hat up and said, I'm done. I put my bonnet on and went to sleep. But I love this notion of it's a multi-pronged experience for change, right? Like the individual can be accountable for only so much, but we really need to have it happen at a legislative level. Policy is what informs our world, right? And the personal as political is one thing, but if we don't have laws that are actually writing in the future we want to see, it makes it quite difficult. And so I would love to hear like what Afrofuturist values, sentiments, or ideologies do you feel still need to be incorporated into policy? Or maybe there's an example that you might be able to share that is, I guess, taking Afrofuturist values and implementing it today.
So one of the things I'm really excited about in our own project, Black in 2042, is that we're going to be speaking to this woman in Evanston. She must be a policymaker because there's no other way she's done this, but she has enacted housing reparations within Evanston because redlining, ground zero for redlining was Chicago and the surrounding areas. And so by giving a block of families access to free housing is one of the ways that a policy is being used to fundamentally change the future of not just that family, but their subsequent, everybody in that line that comes afterwards. And I really like that as an Afrofuturist policy because I think within the Afrofuturist project, there is this idea of wholeness, whether we're thinking about the parable of the sower, and I'm forgetting the character's name, but the woman that starts Earthseed, she has agency. She leaves her father's church. She creates something quite different, and in creating that different thing creates this new world, right? If we think about again, Maddie, that I referenced earlier from Maddie's rocket, she goes to the 30s, she fights the KKK, she uses this rocket to rescue Black people. If we think about Wakanda, these are this is a self-determined state. And so I would say anything from a policy perspective, anything that I'm seeing in the reparations movement is an Afrofuturist policy, but it doesn't need to be something that just benefits Black people. I think even if we look at inclusive design, the dips in the pavement, so that people who are being wheeled, whether they are in wheelchairs, whether they're in strollers, so that they can easily get off the pavement, is another example of inclusive design. And when you design for the marginalized, you're actually designing for Black people, because it's so often that we are in those groups. And you're certainly designing for a woman that loves wearing high-heeled shoes. You're certainly designing for me. So I see those types of interventions as being Afrofuturist. I see, when I look at cities who are really thoughtfully thinking about how automized vehicles are going to operate in their cities, and if they should, I also see that as an Afrofuturistic design, just because part of Afrofuturism for me is this thoughtfulness with an ear to equity and justice. And anytime I see a policy making environment that centers those two questions, I see the traits of Afrofuturism, because without justice, I don't think that you get to these futures that people are trying to build. Those are the ones. But I'm not doing the interviewing. I actually don't do a lot of the work. I don't do a lot of the execution at AI for the people, but I think that's going to be a really dope conversation.
Nice. There's another question that we definitely wanted to hit before we wrapped up around what you think futurism looks like on a local level.
Many of the things that I described, I think a good way of entering that conversation is trying to imagine what would the most marginal person in our environment need to thrive, and then creating policies towards that. My assumption is that they would need housing, that they would need access to healthy, delicious, and exciting food that is culturally relevant to them and for their palate. My assumption is that they would want to be educated in such a way that embraces them. I think many of us, I have an elite education and I'm still recovering from that ridiculous experience of white spaces, like just randomly violent for no reason. And my assumption is that they would want the same level of education I've received in a much more culturally responsive environment to them. My assumption is that they would need access to healthcare and be cared for within a space in which they would receive the same level of care as anybody else. My assumption is that they would want religious and spiritual spaces where they can happily convene with the divine. And that's something that we often are not seeing with people that have a Jewish faith. Like there is an attack on synagogues in this country. And I think once you give people the elements of what they need, then you're into the realm of Afrofuturism. And the great thing about Black people always is that if you can solve for Black people, you are solving for everybody, because the things I'm describing are not just good for Black futures, they're good for all futures. And the way that I have constructed a life where I can be left alone and thrive, that is part of my defense as a Black person that loves Black people and does Black things, to move through. But that's not everybody's experience. So how do we figure out what different types of people need? Because, you know, I'm at a stage where there's some things that go down, and these allies and co-conspirators will try and draw me in. And I'm just like, you know, that sounds like a really white problem. I don't think I can add here.
I absolutely hear you. I feel like through not just this project, but just being Black and being queer and recognizing, like, okay, if we look at Black trans women and say if their needs are met, all of our needs are met, then why aren't we focusing there? You know, and just to give the possibility there of like, oh, if this person who is at the highest rate of homicide on this planet feels like they can make it in the future, we're all good.
Yeah. Yeah.
And wouldn't that just be a lovely thing? So I just wanted to thank you for reflecting that out. I want to thank you for your time and your contribution to helping our community and beyond. It's been so beautiful to talk to you, Mutale. Like, I know we've been trying to connect for such a long time, and so it's really beautiful to hear what you've been doing. I want to follow it and support it, and thank you for being part of this project.
And thank you for the invitation. The pleasure is definitely mine. And having spent time in Seattle, you are brave and you are bold. And I am so proud to be part of that, because my Seattle is not a Black Seattle. So this is really exciting to me.
And it's funny because there is a Black history in Seattle. You know, the Central District used to be predominantly Black, and now I think it's 6% or maybe 3%. All I have to say is it's under 10%. Okay, and it's not what it used to be. And so it's really important to have these conversations and to remind people that Black people did live in Seattle and still live in Seattle and will live in Seattle. And yeah, the the Blackest thing in Seattle does not have to be Starbucks coffee.
No.
It could be its people.
Yeah.
Yeah, I just have to echo what Mia said in terms of I'm so grateful that you were able to have this conversation today. And yeah, I mean, I, you are also a part of creating that Seattle that you want to see, you know, by having this conversation. I feel like part of what was so beautiful about this conversation was it felt like that multi-pronged. We got different approaches that, you know, we can take on a policy level that the city of Seattle can implement themselves. We got to hear a little bit about how we as individuals can participate in this. We saw how as artists we play a huge role in creating that future. So I'm really so grateful that you were able to share all of your wisdom with us today.
Well, please don't be strangers, but please ask Aaliyah to schedule me, because I will say yes.